Last season, the Portland Trailblazers went 35-39, putting them at 9th in the Western Conference, but they won their play-in to get into the playoffs, but they were eliminated in the first round by the Lakers. Their top performers were Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum, and Jusuf Nurkic. Their more interesting player is Gary Trent Jr. Last season, Dame put up 30 points per game, 8 assists, 46.3% from the field, and 40.1% from 3 on 10.2 attempts per game. Yeah, flat out, this was Dame's career year. This was his best year as an NBA player. He was probably a top 3 offensive talent last year because of the incredible efficiency he had while taking so many three-point shots, so many of his own creations, so many of high degree difficulty. He was on another planet last year. And this kind of really thrusted the Damian Lillard versus Stephen Curry conversation. Of course, because Stephen Curry was injured last year and Damian Lillard was really showing out. Yeah, Damian Lillard really asserted himself as a top 10 player last year. That leaves a lot of people to believe that maybe Damian Lillard can be the best player on a championship team if that team is really well built around him. CJ McCollum put up 22 points per game, 4 assists per game on 45% from the field and 38% from 3. CJ struggled a bit to start out the season, but he kind of came along of late. He's a pretty good second scoring option. I'd say that's pretty good output for somebody who is your second option. The issue just with CJ is his fit next to the number 1 option, who is Dame. They're playing the same backcourt and they're basically the same size, 6'2", 195 or 190 or something like that. And that's just a recipe for disaster defensively. They're a really small backcourt and they get picked on. They especially got picked on in the playoffs going against a big team in the Los Angeles Lakers. Like I said, Damian Lillard might be able to be the best player on a championship team if that team is built right around him. And I don't think CJ McCollum is that player to be around Damian Lillard just because of the defensive fit. But this Portland Trailblazers front office isn't too ambitious. They don't make a lot of trades to really shake things up. So I think they're just going to roll with their dynamic duo in the backcourt and just remain undersized and hope they can outgun everybody. Jusuf Nurkic last year in 8 regular season games put up 17.5 points per game, 10 rebounds, 4 assists, 1.4 steals, 2 blocks on 49.5% from the field. Jusuf Nurkic is one of the more all-around centers in basketball. He's one of the better playmaking centers behind Bam Adebayo and Nikola Jokic, of course. I think Nurkic is probably the 3rd best playmaking center. You can argue between him and Cat. He's a solid defender. He's never really been like a high-level shot blocker, but in those 8 regular season games he played, coming back from his injury in the bubble, he got 2 blocks per game, and he's always been somebody who could savvily get into the passing lanes and get a lot of steals at the center position. Nurkic is not really a dominant low post player, but he can take advantage of mismatches, and whenever he does get good solid low post position under the rim, he can create something down low. The addition of Nurkic last year in the bubble was really what pushed the Trailblazers to making the playoffs last year. And I think with him being in the Trailblazers lineup for a full season, he could be what leads the Trailblazers to success this upcoming season. Gary Trent Jr. put up 9 points per game on 44.4% from the field and 41.8% from 3 on 4.4 attempts per game. Gary Trent Jr. was like the bright spot. Well, besides Damian Lillard being on another planet last year, Gary Trent Jr.'s emergence was really a pleasant surprise for the Trailblazers. Not only did he emerge as one of the best shooters for Portland, but he also emerged as one of the best perimeter defenders. With Trevor Ariza going out with injury and not wanting to come back to the bubble, this Trailblazers team really lacked defense. They've always had an issue in terms of defense because they have an undersized backcourt that's pretty subpar defensively. They've always had that. And they've tried to cycle in and out players on the wings to really help Dame and CJ on defense. They've had Al-Farouq Aminu, Mo Harkless, Trevor Ariza most recently. And now Gary Trent Jr. has kind of emerged as this team's best perimeter defender. I didn't really see it in the regular season before the bubble, but I saw it on display in the bubble and in the playoffs when they put him on LeBron James at many times. I'd say the Portland Trailblazers had a pretty solid off-season. On the trade market, they traded for Robert Covington, giving away Trevor Ariza and their number 16 pick, and a protected pick in 2021 to the Houston Rockets. Robert Covington is one of the best 3-and-D role players in the entire league. He's kind of developed that respect over the past couple of years of his time in Philly, then Minnesota, then most recently Houston. He's a multi-positional forward. He was playing center for Houston last year. No other team's going to play Robert Covington at center, but that just shows his versatility. He can guard, I'd say he can guard 2 through 4 pretty comfortably. And he's a pretty great help defender and a guy in terms of rotating and making all the right switches. He's not the best on-ball defender, but I mean, if you're Portland, you take any additional defensive help that you can get. And definitely getting Robert Covington and upgrading from Trevor Ariza, that's a definite move that Portland had to make. And they also got Enes Kanter from Boston. I do not know the terms of that trade, and I wasn't really going to try to look for it. In the draft, they got CJ Ellaby and Moses Brown. Now they got CJ Ellaby at number 46, and Moses Brown was undrafted. I don't know anything about these two. I'm just going to have to wait and see on them. And in free agency, they brought back Rodney Hood on a 2-year, $21 million contract. 2 years ago, Rodney Hood was important for them in the playoffs because he had a couple big games against Denver coming off the bench. Rodney Hood's always been like a microwave type of player, instant offense, doesn't need that much time to make a big impact on the offensive end, putting the ball in the hoop. And they bring him back on a pretty solid team-friendly contract. If Rodney Hood can stay healthy, this is somebody who can definitely bolster their bench. And speaking of people that can bolster their bench, they bring back Carmelo Anthony, who had a resurgence last year. He was putting up around 15 points, around 43 or 44% from the field, and I think in the upper 30s in terms of 3-point percentage. He was pretty great for the Trailblazers last year as their definitive third option, with Nurkic not in the lineup, Hassan not really being an offensive threat. Carmelo was really the third option for Portland last year. I think going to the bench where there's going to be even less pressure and less attention on him with a playmaker like Nurkic coming back, Dame and CJ are still there, Rodney Hood's going to be his partner off the bench. Carmelo Anthony is going to be even more efficient. They're bringing Harry Giles on a 1-year minimum contract. I don't think that's that much of an important signing. And they also bring in Derrick Jones Jr. on a 2-year, $19 million contract. Derrick Jones Jr. is one of the most athletic players in our league. Always has these highlight level alley-oops, but he's really developed into somebody who can be a multi-positional defender, especially playing in Miami where defense was preached. They kind of used him as their Swiss Army knife before they had Jay Crowder. If he can continue to develop and just become more savvy on the defensive end and be a bit more consistent in terms of that 3-ball, Derrick Jones Jr. can be somebody very valuable for Portland. Looking at their depth chart, at the guard positions they have Dame, CJ, Trent Jr., and Anthony Simons. At the forward positions they have Rocco, Derrick Jones, Rodney Hood, and Melo. And at the center positions they have Yusuf Nurkic, Enes Kanter, and Zach Collins, who's recovering from an injury. And coaching them is Terry Stotts, who I think is a slightly above average coach. Next season I project the starting lineup to be Dame, CJ, Rocco, Derrick Jones Jr., and Yusuf Nurkic. I think with Zach Collins being hurt, they're going to go with Derrick Jones Jr. at the power forward position. With Dame and CJ in your backcourt, you're going to need as many multi-positional switchy forwards in your lineup and rotation and starting lineup, of course, that you can get. And you kind of have two of those guys in Rocco and Derrick Jones. And then you have your all-around defensive center in Yusuf Nurkic down low. I think the Trailblazers will go around 42-30, putting them at around the 6th seed in the Western Conference. Damian Lillard was able to carry the Trailblazers to an 8th seed, well, not to an 8th seed, to a 9th seed into a play-in tournament. And you're giving him back one of the more all-around centers in our league in Yusuf Nurkic for an entire season, hopefully, if he can stay healthy. Bringing in a multi-positional 3-and-D forward in Rocco. Bringing back Rodney Hood, who was injured for basically all of last year, one of the more microwave instant offense type of guards. Bringing back Melo on a minimum contract, somebody who was putting up 15 points pretty efficiently. You're bringing him back on a lower usage role, so it will be more efficient. I think this Blazers team is definitely playoff caliber. I think they'll be around the realm of the Golden State Warriors, Phoenix Suns, kind of that tier below the upper echelon of the Western Conference. I do think they will get eliminated in the first round because simply they're not in that upper echelon. And the direction for this Trailblazers team is retooling. They cannot rebuild for the foreseeable future because Dame is their franchise player. He's going to go down as the best player in Trailblazers history over Clyde Drexler eventually. So he's going to be a Blazer for life. He's already said he's going to be loyal to that franchise and he's not going to leave. So as long as you have that caliber of a player on your team that's pretty confirmed to you that he's not going to leave, you can't rebuild. You have to keep competing. You have to try and keep building around that player and finding that perfect roster to the point where you're confident they can make a championship run. So they're retooling. They're trying to find that perfect roster around Dame, and we saw the efforts of them doing that in terms of that Rocco trade, adding a multi-positional defender. I don't think that trade is enough to really say they found the perfect roster, but it is enough to say that they are taking the steps to, or they're attempting to try and find that roster, because we've criticized the Portland Trailblazers in the past for being too complacent and not really going after somebody. But with this Rocco trade, I think we can say that is the first step. The Blazers should definitely be better this season than they were last year. They'll have a fully healthy Yusuf Nurkic starting at center, who is simply more impactful on the court than Hassan Whiteside. Dame is coming off his best year as a pro, establishing himself as one of the league's best offensive weapons. Much of the core remains, CJ as one of the best second scoring options in the league. The Blazers brought back Rodney Hood and Melo, who will definitely provide great scoring off the bench, and Gary Trent Jr. is back, who emerged as the best perimeter defender on the team last year. Adding Rocco and DJJ provides more defensive versatility. Portland was already among the league's best offenses last year, and they addressed their holes defensively for this upcoming season, but in a more competitive Western Conference, I don't think their transactions will be enough to establish them as a real contender.